I was 11 when I was first taken to see somebody about my fears. My fears, my parents called them. In fact, they were almost paralyzing thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about all the horrors of the world. These thoughts had been there for as long as I could remember. I don't know where they came from. Maybe it was my grandmother's Holocaust stories. Maybe it was growing up in a country that was in a constant state of war. Or maybe it was just those fairy tales we all tell kids about witches who try to eat innocent children or poison innocent women. I was terrified of the world. I was always told I was too sensitive. I cared about everything, empathized with everyone. Life was hard, they all said. If I were to survive, and more importantly, succeed in this world, I needed to toughen up, for my own good. Well, if this life business is so scary and painful, why should I want to have anything to do with it? Life didn't come easily or naturally to me. I looked around me and I saw people going to work, making friends, eating. They seemed to be good at this life thing. They didn't seem to feel, like I did, that they were walking through every day wearing cement boots. I felt like an alien. I was merely visiting Earth. I wasn't truly from here. The ways of the world felt foreign to me. When I developed anorexia at 13, it was to me the opposite of a suicide attempt. My anorexia was the only way my subconscious could devise to make it possible for me to stay alive, not fully committing to life, but not dying either. Anorexia allowed me to remove myself from the world while staying in it, to dull the pain of my soul by inflicting pain on my body, to make me believe there could be a place for me by taking up less and less physical space. Anorexia distracted me from my fears just enough to live another day. I'm Liron Cohen.
I'm Karin,
and we are changing the conversation about eating disorders.
So, in both clinical and popular texts, anorexic teenagers are often described as afraid of growing up, afraid of not being perfect, or afraid of fat and weight gain. But it sounds like many of the fears you experienced leading up to anorexia were mainly concerned with the cruelty and violence that human beings can inflict on one another. Did you feel that your fears were understood by your treatment team?
I'm trying to think back to my early teenage years, and I just never remember that my fear of the world or fear of life, which are kind of very big, big fears, I never felt that they were legitimized in any of my treatments. We mostly dealt with more practical aspects of my life, like family dynamic and school, and things that were more kind of practical fears. I felt that my fears of life and the world, which again seemed like they were very, very big themes, I felt that they were very abnormal. I felt that they meant that that something was wrong with me and that I wasn't fit for life. I didn't think that it didn't feel like there was anything that could be done about such fears, such big, big existential fears, that could ever make me truly feel like I belonged in this world and like I had a chance in actually dealing with life. I just don't remember ever getting the feeling that those big, big existential fears that I had were anything normal or common or anything that wasn't just this big, shameful secret that meant that something was very deeply wrong with me on a very, very basic, fundamental level.
Why do you think your fears were not taken seriously?
I don't know if they weren't taken seriously so much as maybe I wasn't in a position back then when I was so young and didn't know much about anything to truly explain. But I think that when I look at my treatments throughout, because when I was 11, it was before I had the eating disorder, I was taken into treatment for my fears as well. And I think what most of my therapists focused on was trying to deal with things they could deal with. And a fear of the world was not something you could deal with. At some point I received medication that pretty much was the only thing that I think they felt could help with my general anxieties. I was taught various techniques to how to deal with my fears and the physical symptoms they manifested in. For example, when I was young, I felt like I was choking. I felt like I was, my throat was constricting and I couldn't breathe when I was having these panics. And they focused on dealing with the fears that they could actually do something about. I don't think that at any point we actually talked about these big fears that there was nothing to do about. I don't know if I didn't communicate it well enough, or if the book said, well, she's too enmeshed with her mother and she's, they focus on because I did present some classic anorexic problems that they focused on. So yeah, I don't think at any point anybody, probably me included, felt that there was anything to do about it.
So this leads me to my question about what you said about anorexia as a way to survive in an unbearable world. So your description really resonated with things I heard from many of the people who participated in my research. But I think this apparent paradox of eating disorders is quite difficult for many people to contend with. Because on the one hand, an eating disorder is dangerous and potentially fatal. And on the other hand, you're describing it as the condition that allowed you to stay alive. Can you explain a bit more how, in your experience, anorexia enabled you to survive?
Yes, I know it sounds very kind of shocking and controversial when I just say, things like anorexia saved me. And I understand the difficulty in it. And of course, it is a very dangerous condition. It's not that I advocate for anybody to use anorexia as a means of survival. Of course, it happened to me without consciously choosing for it to happen. But I truly feel that my subconscious did just try to hold on to something. And when I was thinking about what anorexia did for me at the time, it actually has done many things. The first thing is distraction. It took some very, very abstract anxieties and poured them into one seemingly tangible and manageable fear. Which was food and weight and gaining weight. And it gave me something to do. It gave me something to physically and mentally obsess over that I felt I actually had control over. But also, it kind of felt like I was in charge of my own suffering. When I was inflicting pain on myself, when I was punishing myself, I was basically taking all these fears that I had of other people inflicting pain and suffering on me, and I felt that I was doing it to myself, and so I was in a very kind of twisted way protecting myself from being hurt by others because I was already hurting myself. It also gave me a sense of purpose. That helped me separate myself from the world because I felt that I was very much enmeshed with everything that was going on around me. I was empathizing with everybody. And so having this kind of a pseudo identity helped me separate myself from the world. And at the same time, it also sent a message to the world that I was sick. I should not be expected to lead a normal life. And that was very important at the time because I felt that all these expectations that people had of other people, and I was growing up. I started having to assume more responsibility. I had to. There were assumptions about where I should go, what I should do, and I felt that sick people did not have to live up to any kind of normal expectations, and that was very important. That to me that. I didn't have to live up to any expectations that I felt that I couldn't live up to, and it also sent the world a message that I needed to be protected. I was different. I should be treated differently. I should be cared for. So it actually did a lot for me at the time, and of course it was all subconscious. I wasn't doing it on purpose, but my subconscious was wiser than I was.
It sounds like anorexia was almost a way of drawing boundaries for yourself, both socially and from a sensory perspective as well.
That was one, yes, absolutely. That was one of the things that I remember quite distinctly. I would, when I felt overwhelmed, especially in a crowd or when I was among people that I didn't know, or when I was in distress because something around me that was happening was distressful, I remember reminding myself consciously that I had anorexia. And that was what reminded me who I was and how I was separated from everybody around me. And I just kind of spontaneously felt I needed to do that because I was feeling so. I felt like I didn't have any skin, like I was completely submerged in everything around me, and I couldn't protect myself any other way.
That's a really powerful image, not having any skin.
I've said that many times, and I think that there are a lot of us. Including to this day, I don't think it's something that necessarily changes. It's something about a person's makeup when somebody is extremely sensitive or extremely empathetic, and you just learn to deal with it in healthier ways, hopefully.
And as you move towards recovery, what enabled you to engage with your fears differently? How did your experience of being in the world change?
I'm happy you asked how I engage differently with my fears. You didn't ask what canceled my fears, what made them go away, because they never did. And I, like I just said about being empathetic or sensitive, I don't necessarily think that if who you are, who part of your makeup is being a more anxious person, being a more empathetic person, I don't necessarily think that recovery would change that. But you do learn to control them differently or respond to them differently. And I think that especially these days when the world seems to be headed in some darker directions, I think a lot of those anxieties are especially high for a lot of people. I think that mostly what I learned was to shift my focus onto some more positive things, which doesn't cancel out the negatives, but it does remind me that there are positives, and it balances out. You also I also learned to be more comfortable with not having control. Which is something that is kind of hard to come to terms with, but you do have to eventually come to terms with the fact that you don't have control over a lot of things. But also, I kind of learned to rely on myself more, to be more confident in my abilities to handle difficulties, to handle those things that are out of control that I can anticipate would happen at some point in my life. So yeah, and accepting fear, accepting life with fear. I think acceptance is a very big part of recovery in general.
Is this something that you learned through treatment or something that came about in different ways as well?
Good question. I think in treatment, mostly what was done about my fears was, again, kind of try to help me control it physically, be it with medication, meditation, and other kind of physical ways. I think acceptance was mostly something that I have just kind of learned with the years. At some point, some things that unfortunately just have to come with time, with one getting to know oneself better. And I think that at some point, I just realized that my fears were not going to go away. They could maybe, the volume on them can change and go up and down according to what's going on in my life and how strong I am emotionally at the time, but they were not going to go away. And so I just had to learn to accept them and live with them. And I found throughout the years, through actually probably dealing with the eating disorder, that acceptance is a very, very powerful tool, I'll call it, in recovery. And so I try to approach everything in myself and in my life with acceptance now. I find that it already neutralizes a lot of the problematic aspects of whatever it is that I'm dealing with. And then just learning that fear is part of life, and taking it one day at a time and focusing on the good in my life, which is also something that had to I had to learn to do. And you know what? I think a big part of it is understanding that anxiety is also a physical issue. I know that my fight or flight mechanism is off. I know that my amygdala works in a different way. And so learning a lot about the physical aspects of this also helped me accept it and move on with trying to incorporate it in my life rather than try to fight against it, which was futile. You know, I was really happy to hear that you said existential suffering was actually a big common denominator that you have heard in many of the stories from people that you've talked to, because obviously it's something that I always kept to myself mostly, and I would love to know more about what you've heard from others.
Yeah, so this is a story that I wrote about coming to terms with the seeming gap that exists between social understandings of what eating disorders are and people's experiences of suffering in eating disorders. When I first began studying eating disorders, I was surprised to discover that, upon hearing my research topic, some people felt the need to react by referring to their own weight. Remarks like, "As you can see, I don't suffer from anorexia," or even, "I could use a little anorexia myself," were strangely frequent. I say strangely because, as a student who had been immersed in research on eating disorders, these awkward remarks were worlds away from the lived realities of suffering that both the literature and my own fieldwork research had conveyed. And yet these remarks, which seemed to jokingly conflate the often stigmatized and marginalized bodies of people with eating disorders with the bodies of my, as far as I know, healthy conversation partners, were not entirely out of the blue. In being focused on food and weight, eating disorders seem to follow a cultural logic in which mainstream society partakes, a logic of dieting in which thin and fit bodies are overvalued, imagined and pursued as prized emblems of strength, desirability, and success. The key word here, however, is seen. While eating disorders seem to follow this logic, they do not necessarily share it. Anthropologist Rebecca Lester wrote in her 1997 article, The Disembodied Self in Anorexia Nervosa, that while women with anorexia might use food and fasting, in Lester's words, to tailor a self and protect the body's boundaries from the outside world, their preoccupation with food and thinness is socially interpreted as conforming to dominant cultural narratives about women's preoccupation with attractiveness. Paradoxically, then, an attempt to shield oneself from society becomes read as an attempt to immerse oneself in society. And what is missing in this particular reading is a realization of the suffering that people with eating disorders experience, both through their condition and independently from it.
It sounds like in your experience, and I've had the same experience many times, of people confuse and conflate anorexia with dieting or strong willpower. You know, and I could use a little bit of anorexia. In other words, they are stripping the disorder from its mental health aspect and remaining with the physical aspect, which they consider a positive. What do you think are the consequences of that? And does that help make eating disorders more quote unquote normalized, help people relate to them, or does it make them even more invisible and keeps them from being fully understood by society?
I think that while these discourses, in some respects, normalize eating disorders by equating them with dieting practice, which is very common, at the same time, what ends up happening is that eating disorders are not taken as seriously as they should be. I think that too often people misjudge eating disorders. They think that eating disorders are a choice, or that people can just start eating normally and then not have an eating disorder anymore. And part of that is the fact that they're understood through this prism of dieting culture. when people think that they know why a person has an eating disorder, they don't really bother asking. And so what ends up happening is that people's experiences are subsumed into a cultural discourse that might not actually reflect what they're going through. I've heard time and again from participants how frustrated they felt that their eating disorder was understood as taking part in this broader diet culture. And they felt constantly misunderstood and reduced to an external appearance or reduced to the level of practice. And that was something that I heard from many.
And what do you think are some of the greater ramifications that this very shallow understanding and this kind of vicious cycle, because there is this dieting culture, and then it seems like eating disorders seem to be sucked into that rather than comment on it or even make people a little more aware of how ridiculous this dieting culture is. What do you think some of the ramifications might be for this reducing of eating disorders into just part of dieting culture?
Well, I think in the US, we can see that very clearly. In the private health insurance system, there have been a lot of battles waged by people with eating disorders and their families against insurance companies that refuse to acknowledge eating disorders as necessitating treatment, because it was so easy to cast eating disorders as a choice or as something relating to a diet gone wrong or to a lifestyle. And so I think this really illustrates how social discourse can have really serious life-altering consequences for people who need healthcare, for example.
It's so ironic because I was going to ask you when you said that, I was going to say, really, to this day? Because I had assumed we are past the point where eating disorders are being questioned as true, life-threatening mental issues. But that actually makes me wonder, because back in the day, when I was struggling with eating disorders, I know that the question of whether or not eating disorders were considered mental illnesses, it was a pretty controversial topic. And I do wonder where we stand on that now, on that question.
So actually in 2008, the Academy for Eating Disorders published a position paper calling for recognition of eating disorders as serious mental illnesses. In their words, specifically as brain-based mental illnesses, or BBMIs. One of the main reasons for this position paper was the lack of healthcare parity in the United States. And what the authors were arguing for is a recognition of eating disorders as biologically based, brain-based mental illnesses, as serious conditions that require healthcare.
So what we're saying is that we started this conversation talking about existential suffering and how universal the foundation for eating disorders is, and how important it is that everyone receives recognition so that they're able to get the treatment that they need. And this is a very interesting segue to lead us to next month's podcast, which will be about diversity in eating disorders. Thank you for joining us and changing the conversation. Feel free to email us at any time with comments, questions, or anything else to changetheconvoed@gmail.com.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media, where we also have links to other resources and further reading. Look for Changing the Conversation About Eating Disorders on Facebook and at ChangeConvoED on Twitter.
We hope you join us again for our next episode on the first Tuesday of next month.